Welcome to the LB's The Lover of Books author chat. Now to introduce this debut author. Laura Spence-Ash, her debut novel, Beyond That, the Sea, was published by Celadon Books on March 21st, 2023. The novel received a starred review from Publishers Weekly, was named a GMA Buzz Pick, and is an Indie Next Pick for April 2023. Her short fiction has appeared in One Story, New England Review, Crazy Horse, and elsewhere. Her critical essays and book reviews appear regularly in Plowshare's blog. She received her MFA in fiction from Rutgers, New York, and she lives in New Jersey. New York Times said, and I love this review, the plot of Laura Spence-Ash's Beyond That the Sea is rooted in the home front upheavals of World War II, but it's also a timeless exploration of what it means to create a family, of how dreams can die and be reborn in surprising ways. Welcome, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're so glad to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk about the book for the next hour. Thank you.
Well, this is a perfect segue because I want you to go ahead and tell us in your words what you think this book is about.
So the book is about two families whose lives become intertwined when the daughter of a British family is sent to live with an American family during the Blitz. She lives with them for 5 years and then returns to London. And the book follows both families for over 30 years. And I think it's a book that's primarily about family, but also about love and about grief and about what time does. Over time, what happens?
Well, this book has been blurred by lots of great authors. As a matter of fact, two of the authors that I've spoken to in the LB's author chats, Ann Napolitano and Alice Elliott-Dark, both blurbed your book. And even on the Today Show, I saw Julia Quinn, the Bridgerton author, recommended your book as well. What does that mean for you as a debut author?
Oh, it just means everything. I am just eternally grateful to all the people the early readers who blurbed it, but also everyone since then who's read it and has come back to me and talked to me about what they liked about the book. It's been such a pleasure to be out and about talking to readers and sharing this story that I worked on for a long time with everyone else. It's really been fantastic.
Well, how long did you work on this book?
So the original idea when I first heard about the fact that children were sent to the United States and not just sent to the country, which is what I think most of us assumed, was in 1998, I read an article in the New York Times that talked about a group of older British adults who were sent to the States during the war, and they came back to see where they had lived. And as I said, I had no idea that had happened. And I was just fascinated. My kids were little at the time. They were 1 and 5, and I wasn't writing, but I just couldn't stop thinking about this and thinking about that idea of that impossible choice to send your child away because that would be the safest thing for them. So I read when I could things about it, and I read a memoir by a man who had been sent to a town south of Boston, and it turned out completely coincidentally that he and I had been in the same town because I went to high school there and he was living there for those few years during the war. In fact, we went to the same school because I was there as a boarding school student and he was there as a day student because he was living with a family in town. And for me, that struck such a bell because that was the first time I'd been away from my family, away from home. And obviously my experience was very, very different from his. But I knew what it was like to be in that place and to miss my family and feel far from home. And so I immediately, upon reading that, I'd been sort of thinking about this novel in my head, and all of a sudden I had a setting and everything else kind of grew out of that. And that was about 2008, 2009. So even that was a very long time ago. But I think I couldn't quite figure out the right way to tell the story. I kept trying, and then I kept putting it away, thinking I'm not good enough for this. And then in the middle there, I actually did go get an MFA, which helped tremendously in terms of my self-confidence and kind of knowing what I was doing. And I did that from 2014 to 2016. And then after that, I returned to the novel more seriously, and then kind of wrote it over the next few years in there.
Did you know you always wanted to write a novel? Because it looks like you've been writing other types in other formats, but tell us about that. Was that always your goal?
It was not always my goal. I mean, I did have this idea for this novel, but it's not like that's been my, I met a lot of people over these years, writers who they absolutely are novelists, and they set out because they wanted to be a novelist. That was their goal. And it really wasn't for me. It was really more learning how to write and learning how to tell a story. I love short stories. I love writing short stories. And sometimes I wish novels could just be a whole bunch of little short stories, because I just love the way you can sort of hold a short story in your hand in a way that you can't with a novel. A novel feels still to me enormous. So, no, but I did have this story, and that really drove me. It drove me, I think, initially to get the MFA, because I knew I had this thing I wanted to write. I just couldn't figure out how to do it, and I needed the training to do it.
Well, I would say 30 years of a timeline is enormous. And so that is biting off a lot in your first novel. Tell us about that MFA program, because you said that you needed the confidence and the skills. So what was it about that in particular that got this book moving?
It was really spending those 2 years dedicated to writing. I mean, I had kept my writing very close to myself. I really didn't share it with a lot of people. Many people didn't know I wrote. And I got into this program at Rutgers Newark, and I was on a full teaching fellowship. So it meant I could quit my job and I could do this full time. And so all of a sudden I had to say to the world, to everyone in my life, like, I am a writer. This is what I'm doing now. I'm getting an MFA. And it was that thing of owning that, right? Of saying, I am a writer and this is what I'm doing, that really allowed me to take ownership of it. And then having the privilege of those 2 years when I had to work because I was teaching there, but I was, other than that, solely dedicated to learning about writing and writing. And that was just such a privilege of time, because I really learned so much in those 2 years. I had a wonderful cohort, both fiction writers and poets, which was really wonderful also to be in that community. It was a community of people much younger than I am, which initially I was a little worried about, but actually it turned out to just be the best thing possible. I'm still super close with a number of people in my cohort, and again, I just feel so lucky that I had the time to do that.
Well, it gave me the chills when you said I had to take ownership and say I'm a writer, because that is a big moment. I mean, it basically faces you into a new direction, a new journey, and we're so glad that you did, because what a beautiful novel that came about. So good job, way to get through it. And I think this might be a good time to go ahead and say kind of who the connection is here, our special guest. Do you want to introduce them at all?
Sure. So our special guest is the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Alice Elliott-Dark, who wrote most recently Fellowship Point. She was my professor at Rutgers Newark. She was my thesis advisor. I took a craft class from her in addition to workshop. I do not think I would be sitting here tonight without her guidance. So I feel very lucky that she is in my life, and very lucky that she is, for all of you, that she is here tonight.
Oh, I'm so excited. Welcome, Alice. Thank you so much for joining.
It's wonderful to be here. And thank you so much for those kind words, Laura, but totally not true. You would have gotten here somehow. You would have. You would have. I'm just lucky that I was around your magic.
Why don't you tell us a little bit, give us the inside scoop, Alice, on Laura. Tell us about this process. We would love to hear the inside scoop.
Well, Laura was one of those people who came into the program, and, I saw right away that she understood what fiction is and how it works. Not everybody does, which doesn't mean they can't learn, but some people come in with an understanding of it. And she had a lot of good ideas. I mean, the things she was working on in the program, which were not this book, although I think did I see a little of this book? I saw a little of this book. And I think I saw a little of the one she's actually working on now too. But she was also working on another one that was really good. Also, and they were big, ambitious ideas that had a lot of moving parts and interest in history and interest in all kinds of social issues that I think are very important. And yeah, I mean, I was just excited by her as a writer. And when she showed me this book, you know, you're never sure when you write a book, is this good? You finish it and you're like, I'm done as I can be, but is anyone really going to like it? You just truly don't know. And Laura showed it to me. I was like, Laura, this is a really good book. I mean, you wrote a really, really, really good book. And I feel like I've had to say that to her several times, but now I think enough other people have piled on that maybe it's sunk in. But I was so excited when I read it because I thought this is the real deal. It's a great book.
Yeah. And her first. So like, that's so awesome. Do you believe it now, Laura? Has it sunken in? Like, do you believe like I'm a writer now and this is
a good book,
a great book?
I believe it's a good book. I don't know if I believe it's a great book, but yes, I think it's been hugely gratifying to hear this from lots of people. It's been just lovely. And I had a lot of qualms before the book got out in the world, but I definitely am calmer now. It seems like lots of people have enjoyed it, and that's so gratifying. And I've heard some just wonderful stories from people. I heard from a good friend's mother who had stopped reading, and she gave her a copy of this book, and she liked it, and now she's just reading all the time again. And stories like that just make me feel so happy.
Yeah.
As they should. What a wonderful compliment. I don't know that you could get a much better compliment than that. You just created a reader again. So
I want to say one more compliment about Laura,
please.
and then that there's such a thing as a literary citizen, someone who does a lot for others. And Laura's one of those people. She's so supportive to other writers. She goes to lots of readings. She reads people's work. She just does a lot of things for other writers. And that definitely started when she was in the program. She was very important to everybody, generous, warm, open. So I think that's a side of her that a lot of readers might not know about, but I have the opportunity to say it. So I just felt that I wanted to.
Well, thank you for shining the light on that, because that is a wonderful trait to have. And I'm sure so many writers out there appreciate what you put into their writing as well. Laura, what would you tell a new writer? Any advice you would give, like through this process?
I think it's perseverance almost more than anything else. It's just believing in yourself enough to keep at it day after day, and know that there will be bad days, a lot of bad days. But that if you just keep at it, and if you you don't have to write every day, but if you just keep going and not put things away in a drawer and not look at them for years and years, but believe in yourself enough to keep going, I think that's the trick. There are a lot of writers out there who I think end up falling by the wayside because they don't just keep going. But it's an incredibly hard thing to do. I'm not trying to minimize that. I think it's really hard. There's a lot of rejection in the writing world. And I think it's hard to kind of keep going sometimes when that's what you're facing, but you have to kind of almost put blinders on and just keep at it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Alice, for joining us. Please, you can pop some questions into the chat or ask in a minute at the end too, but thank you so much for joining. I'm going to move on with this interview because I have, me, I have a ton of questions, so we better get going. All right, Laura, let's go ahead and get started with the beginning of this novel, because you talked about the hard decision a parent has to make to send a child overseas, right? And so I think the part that struck me the most was Reg knew what World War I was like for a family, for a childhood. And he talks about, and I loved this quote, the edges of fear. And that really put it in perspective for me. And so what did you mean by that? And how important was that for them as a decision?
I think it meant everything to him. I think he and Millie were in different places on this in terms of whether to send her away or not. And I think he was totally informed by his childhood and what had happened with his brother. And it formed who he was, because he was a child at the time and he saw his older brother going through this. And there was just no way he was going to allow his child to have that same childhood. So for him, the most important thing was to remove her from the situation, and not even remove her just to the country. I think for him, this idea of sending her to America meant that she really would be away, and he wouldn't have to worry about her in the same way. If she'd been sent to the country, of course, they were still worrying about the children that were sent to the country, because you didn't necessarily know where all the bombs were going. So I think it was clearly his call, but I think it was totally based on his childhood and how the person that he had become because of that.
Now, there was some disagreement between the two, but I think the important part was who was to blame really for making this decision, like, and how it was communicated to be. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because that really did shape Bee's perspective of her mother and father.
Right. So she assumes because her mother came home one night and saw her with a gas mask on, and her mother was so appalled by that Bee has always assumed that that's when Millie made the choice to send her away. They never told her that it was Reg's choice. Millie never said that, even though Millie was furious at the time that this had happened, and continued being furious at Reg for making that choice. And Bee doesn't learn that until she's much older, that it was not Millie's choice. And I think, it's amazing, right? How as a child, you can decide these things about your parents, and you can decide these things about who's making what decision, and start a grudge building in you that you don't even really understand, I think. And I think for her, that was exactly what it was. Like, she sort of assumed this thing, and then it took on reality, right? And it took years for them to repair their relationship, in part because of what Bee believed.
And I think even before that, Millie had seemed, it sounded like she was, I don't know, maybe alcohol had started affecting things. She was distancing herself from the family. And then she moves in with the exact opposite person, with Mrs. G. And so they are in direct, just completely different people. And so it almost makes it even more expounded, this break between her and Millie, because of the love and affection that she gets from in America.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I started out really thinking those two were opposites, the two mothers. And it was kind of fun as a writer to play with that idea. But the more that I worked on the novel, and the more I got to know Millie, honestly, the more I empathized with her and could understand her jealousy and her rage, and thinking about your child living with somebody else who seems to be doing a better job perhaps than you did. I could totally understand how she felt. And so I think she changed quite a bit over the course of writing this book, because I really got to know her and understand her. And in my mind, they stopped being opposites as much, right? They came closer together because I was kind of understanding who they both were in a better way.
For me, when I saw the intersection happen was when Mrs. G wrote the letter to Millie, and it became like their lives really began to cross, and they could see each other as people, as mothers, not just who was taking care of Bee at the time. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because I think Millie's brain sort of shifted at that point as well, and she became a much warmer character, in my mind, at least.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. But I do think it's interesting that it took Mrs. G making that gesture, right? She was the one that had to do that. I don't know if Millie would have been the first one to do that. And therefore, I don't know if they would have ever come together in the way that they did towards the end of the book, if Mrs. G hadn't extended that to her.
I agree. I mean, Millie did write the letter about the chess, so she did take a small step, to continue that, but it still wasn't mother to mother, which I think was a much harder barrier to cross. Do you think that the separation was the main cause, the main issue between Bee and Millie, or do you think that they would have had issues anyway? Like, I just wonder, like, without this, would they have had a close relationship?
It's so hard to know, right? It absolutely, so much is built on that separation. And if you think of, not being with your child during those years from 11 to 16, those are really important years in terms of the bond you're forming with your mother, you have formed with your mother. There's a little indication that she'd already started kind of turning away from her, right? And turning towards Reg before she left. So there's a little indication that perhaps things would not have been totally smooth if she had stayed there and not gone away. But I think once that had happened, and once there was this 5-year gap, it was incredibly difficult for them to kind of find each other again once she got back.
Now, this is major spoiler, people. So if you haven't read, because since we're on the topic of Millie, I want to stay on it. So many things she did that just rubbed me the wrong way, or, she made a bad decision or just would say the wrong thing. But all of us mothers do say the wrong thing and parent incorrectly. But one thing that she really did do, which I thought was savior at the end, was when it was time for B to make up her mind, was she going to go forward with G, was she said, young love I'm sorry, like that young love isn't always the best love. Like, she gave her that sage advice to say, I know that you had this relationship with William. And she was really the only one that knew that they had that, encounter in London, really. And she kept it. And she basically said, forget about it. You can have a happy life.
Right. I mean, I love that moment between them. Like, that was the moment where I felt like they'd finally came back together again. Right. And it is fascinating to me, right? She is the one person that knows. And somebody else was asking me, well, do you think perhaps that B is worried that at some point Millie will tell, right? Will tell Gerald. But I think that moment said that she would not, right? I think that was sort of what was happening under the surface there, was she was saying, this is our secret.
Right. I didn't put it past her at the beginning, because she does have a little bit of jealousy in her. She is jealous of B and her adventures, and, Mrs. G and their relationship. And I thought, would she use this? But as soon as that moment happened, I knew she wanted her to truly be happy. And I thought, thank you. Like, that was the most motherly thing you could have done in that situation. And it just made a proud moment for me, because it was very redeeming. And also, yeah, Sam agrees the character evolution for all the characters was done so well throughout the novel. When I think about that development and that this is a debut, my mind is blown. So, and it's so true. I mean, 30 years is a long time to keep characters moving along, and very impressive. I want to move on from Millie, though, and talk about, I believe Mr. G was the one who said he called desire lines. They were the quickest way from here to there. And it was in reference to the forest. But I thought on so many ways that was such an important theme throughout this entire novel. What did you mean by desire lines, and how did you want that to be used?
So I love that term, desire lines. I actually have a short story that I actually wrote in Alice's workshop that's called Desire Lines, about two totally, different characters. But the term desire lines is a term that people use, for example, when they're laying out a city park. They will see how people walk across that park, and that's where they will lie down the sidewalks, and that's called desire lines. So you look to see the patterns of traffic, and then you plan on that. But I just love that term, and I love that idea, and the way that it does it's sort of this double entendre, right? Of yes, it's the shortest way from here to there, but it's also this idea of desire and moving forward in time that I think is baked into this novel throughout.
I definitely do. I think it's a beautiful theme, and could be an English paper somewhere out there within this novel. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, she is so fearful to have to go back to the UK, go back to London. And then when she's in London, she's so fearful to come back to America. So my question is can you ever really go back? And how that concept of, it's never really the same. And so it just was an important part of B's decision making, and she makes some very strange ones along the way. So what were your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it is hard to go back, right? It is hard to go home. And I think that's what kept her in London for as long as she'd stayed in London. And it's what kept her from not thinking about the Gregorys for a long time also. I mean, she really did try to establish herself in London and have her own life and have her own job, and really try as much as possible to kind of forget about the Gregorys. But I think she couldn't quite do that. And then her attention kind of got drawn back, and then the rest of the novel unfolded. But I think that was the difficult thing, and the difficult thing for all of us, right? This idea of going home or going back. You have a picture in your mind, perhaps, of what it might look like, but somehow the reality never quite lives up to that. And I think that's what she was so fearful of, right? Of that she had somehow created this idea in her head, and it was never going to be that. It was never going to be that again. But it certainly wasn't even going to be a version of that, or at least that's what she thought for a long time.
Fear was an important theme throughout this book, and Kelly mentions it, with Millie being so fearful of Mrs. G doing a better job. She talks about her fear that her daughter would feel more love towards Mrs. G, but now we're here talking about the fear of, it's not really what I thought it was, or maybe they don't love me as much, or they've moved on and I'm not as important. And so that really, I think, also kept the book moving, was that fear, and what possibly could be the opposite. I thought it was fantastic. The other part, I think this was a quote: "Looking back is clear, but forward is dreams and fears." I loved that quote, because it is so easy to look back. Why did you want to bring that up?
It parallels with the way I think about writing, actually, is that it's often really hard to, when you're moving forward, when you're writing something, you don't really know what's in front of you. And so sometimes you are very, very scared of that blank screen, right? That blank piece of paper. But you also have all these ideas and dreams of what you want this thing to look like. And you can look to see what you've written before, and it's all very clear, but it's all these two things looking forward. So that was part of it, I think, that is definitely how I think about writing. But I think it's also often the way life does work out, right? We do look forward with dreams and fears, and when we look back, it's so clear to see where we've come from, but we can't really see where we're going. So I like the parallels with writing, but I also do think that's the way life works.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do want to talk about the fear of, well, and was this fear? I don't know. B goes to the United States and doesn't tell anybody that she's there. Why did she do that? Why did she make that decision?
I think she couldn't imagine being there with Millie and having to have Millie in that world, right? She could not imagine doing that for her first time seeing them, to kind of bring Millie along. I think she had those thoughts when she was in Grand Central, like, could she just hop on a train and go up and see them? But I do think fear, again, was at the bottom of that. I mean, she really didn't know what would be waiting for her when she got there. It's all very easy, right? When you're writing letters to someone and that's going back and forth, and that's your mode of communication. But the thought of actually seeing someone face to face after all that time must have been incredibly frightening. But I think the primary motivation was not wanting Millie there too. She was definitely not ready to introduce the two families in that way.
Well, she realized even at a young age that she had to keep, for her own sanity, she had to keep the lives separate. Do you think she was successful in that up to a certain point?
I think she was very successful in that. And I think she is somebody who compartmentalizes, right? She absolutely the Gregorys were those 5 years, and then she came back to London and she tried to forget about them and move forward. Perhaps she didn't forget about them as much as her mother would have liked, but she definitely understood that need to kind of separate. But I think, I think largely that did work for her until it didn't, right? Until she really understood how much she needed the Gregorys in her life, and she wanted to again become part of their family.
Well, I think this is partly where, part of my anger towards Millie is that I think she made that decision because of her mother, and she could see the pain that it caused her mother anytime she brought up any of that family. And so I wonder, it makes me wonder, would she have been so compartmentalized if her mother would have been more accepting and thankful and gracious for this opportunity that B was given, instead of the jealousy side of Millie?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, I'm sure she was doing so much of that. It was just the easier path, right? To make Millie happy, especially when they were living together. It was just easier for her to keep it all to herself and not share about the Gregorys. And in time, I think they just dissipated a little bit because of that. And I think you're right. If Millie had been more opening and honest and welcoming, it would have looked very different. And yet, one of the things I love writing about the past is it makes you think about the present. And, it was so hard to keep up relationships then when you were writing letters. You weren't making that many even phone calls, right? It wasn't email, it wasn't DMing, right? We didn't have all these modes of communication. And so relationships were not able to flourish the way they are now. Things died away because it just wasn't easy to communicate. So as much as I think it would have helped if Millie had been like that, I wonder how much she actually would have stayed in touch with them, how much more than she actually did, because it was just harder to communicate then.
So true. And you said, it works until it doesn't. And one of your quotes was, that regret is the loudest thing left. What did you mean by that? And how did you want it to apply?
I think regret can be a horrible thing, right? It can be a thing that just stays with you forever and ever if you can't figure out a way to get rid of it, a way to sort of solve the thing that caused that regret. And a lot of times you can't, right? A lot of times you have regret after someone has died, for example. I mean, it's Rose, I think, who thinks that, and she's talking about William. And so, yeah, I mean, I regret is something I think a lot about. I think we all carry a fair bit of regret around with us, and it's a difficult thing to know how to handle, right? Especially if you have regret about a relationship with somebody who's no longer here.
The other thing, I think part of that regret is when she goes back because of William's death. I think this happens. I think this might have been for Mrs. G, but when it says, death provides freedom, and that when that happens, you're sort of let loose to make decisions that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think what I remember was this applying to Gerald going down to Mississippi. The question was, would he have done this had William been alive? Do you think that was a catalyst for a lot of getting rid of those regrets?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think so. And I think there are a number of people in this book who find that death provides freedom, right? I mean, Mrs. G's life changes dramatically after Mr. G dies, right? She really comes into her own in a way that she hadn't been before. She'd always been a little bit of his shadow. Certainly we see that with Rose. Certainly we see it with Millie. We even see it with B to a certain extent, right? So it's fascinating to me how death can create these opportunities for people in ways that they probably never expect. And I think that's fascinating.
I do too. I think, that life left unlived mentality kind of sparked something in each of those three women. It was very obvious, your first 7 narrators, but then you chose Rose. Since you brought her up, let's go ahead and talk about Rose. Why did you add her in, her perspective in? Because she seems obviously she's not inside the family as much. She's an add-on later. So give us your reasoning there.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was going to work, honestly. But I liked Rose so much, and I so enjoyed writing her character and her arc. And for me, she was a bit of fresh air about halfway through the book, right? She wasn't a character we'd been with all along. And I just found her fascinating, and I wanted to spend time with her. And so she stayed. And I think she's great because she really gives us sort of an outside perspective on the family a little bit that we don't get from anyone else. We also get to sort of see her up against B, this woman that kind of, took her place with William. And what I really enjoyed about her was her arc with work, to see what happened to her after William died, to see her really coming into her own in a way that so many women in the early 60s came into their own when they finally were able to do so. And that was really fun to write and fun to sort of live through her vicariously and enjoy that for her.
She was also kind of a time marker for us. Like she kept our history in a pace where we knew what was happening, where it was because of the JFK, her fascination, or really maybe more than fascination with the JFK family. So to me, that was an important part too, because it kept my mind on track for where we should be. Was that intended?
I mean, that's how I like to use history in when I'm writing, is just like these little bits that kind of settle us into a place and a time so we know where we are. It's not my primary focus. Obviously my primary focus is on the characters, but I love those little details that you can draw and that you can sort of build this world around them that is very much of that time. That's really fun to do. And yeah, I love doing the research for that and finding like just the right details to put in.
How much research did this book take?
So I because I worked on it for so long, early on and early-ish on, when I wasn't even really writing the book yet, but I was just learning about the process of sending children away. I did a fair bit of research around the Blitz and around kind of domestic life in London during the war. But I love doing research, and I can just get lost in rabbit holes forever. And I realized that I was never actually going to get this book done if I didn't stop doing research. And then, so I took a year-long novel writing class that was taught by Lynn Steger-Strong, who's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And that was a fantastic thing for me because I needed the structure. I needed people waiting for pages, and that provided that for me. And I knew over the course of that year that I really, because I had to hit so many pages at certain times, that I would not have time to do a lot of research. So that was also a great thing for me because it really forced me to write the book, knowing that I could go back and do the research and fill in some of the holes later. But it forced me to just keep going with the book. And that was really fantastic.
It gave you the structure of those guidelines you needed. All right, I have another question about a writing style issue, a writing style choice that you made. So it seems like what I picked up was that you would give these important decisions, like something's about to happen and so much is going on, and then the next chapter, it's already happened. We don't even know. So what is that called? And why this choice? Why did you, like, it just kept me like, tell me who told her, who, like, or what happened at the wedding, all these things. So I would just love to know about that.
I don't know what it's called. What it really is.
Ash method. That's what it is.
There we go. What it really is, I think, is that I'm really interested in the before and the after, right? I want to know what it feels like before something big happens, and then I want to know what it feels like after something happens. I'm not as interested in the big moment itself. And so I think it stems out of that I'm really fascinated with that. And I really do shy away from big moments in this book, but also in general with my writing. Like I don't really want to focus on the big dramatic, things. I want to know what happened before and after. And that's, yeah, as you say, I think that I kind of didn't realize it myself as I was writing. And then somebody actually in that year-long class was like, oh, I finally figured out that you're never going to write about those big moments. It's always going to be before and after. I was like, okay.
Well, yeah, Leslie said, I love that aspect of the book. It focuses on the characters and their feelings and reactions more than the event. So, and Jill says the same thing. She really liked it. For me, it was just like, Paige, like, what happened? Like, did I miss it? So it was very much a hooker for me. And I don't know that I've ever read a book like that. I think it was very fascinating approach. And definitely the Spence-Ash method. I think it's the way to classify that. You got Alice, you can go ahead and put that into your class as a method. But I do want to know, I have to ask this question. Do you have, we're changing tracks, by the way. William, very interesting character. Do you have a diagnosis for him? Was he depressed? Like,
he was probably depressed, although I don't think he would have been called that at that time. But I think he was. I think we probably all know people like William, right? These kind of golden golden children who somehow grow up and can't figure out where to be, right? That all of a sudden these things that they thought were going to be handed to them are not, and they're kind of adrift and they can't figure out how to make sense out of their life. He seems a malcontent to me and just never could quite figure out how to make kind of life work for him. And he was consequently, I would say, the most difficult character to write, because I couldn't really understand that, because I'm not like that. And so it was really hard to kind of get inside his brain and understand why he made the choices he made and why he behaved the way he did. And I ended up feeling really sad for him, that he couldn't kind of break out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting take on him because, at one point I'm wondering, did you mean for there to be a love triangle between B, Gerald, and William? Was that ever part of your thought process, or do you think there wasn't?
I think there was. I never planned that, but I sort of knew, I'm sure, right from the beginning, that once I had the two brothers and her being in the middle of the two age-wise, that there'd be tension and conflict between the three of them. And 3 is always a good number for tension and conflict. But I don't know that I was really thinking necessarily about a love triangle. Other people have asked me about whether I knew she was going to end up with Gerald, and I certainly didn't know that. I think I did know pretty early on that she wasn't going to end up with William, that was a relationship that was not going to last, because they were just not really made for each other as adults. I think as, a first love, fine, but it wasn't really an adult relationship. And I think B realized that way before William did.
Yeah. And I think also the fact that Gerald was younger than them makes it more of an isosceles or a different, because he wasn't really ready for any kind of relationship when she and William connected initially, right? I mean, he was so much younger than them. And so I think that's why I don't think that there was a triangle, just because they never were in the same place at the same time emotionally, any of the 3 of them, for so long. But I did find it a fascinating thought process to think, with the brothers, who weren't really that close without B. They only were close when she was there. So that was, and I think their mother saw that also, it was fascinating. And then my last question before we break, which we're getting close, does B have a right to her secrets, especially with regards to G?
I think she does. I think we all have a right to our secrets. I think she made a very calculated choice, and she knew what she wanted, and she wasn't sure what the outcome would be if she made a different choice. And I think she probably thought long and hard about what giving that information to Gerald would do, and what he would do with that information and how much it might hurt him. And I think she just decided that wasn't the way she wanted to go. And I think she does have a right to do that.
I agree. I didn't want to sway you one way or the other because I also have this exact same opinion, but I wanted to hear your perspective. B doesn't really take any choice without thought. Like, she really thinks through things, and she's a very thoughtful person. And so I think it took her 30 years. I mean, not 30, but a long time for her to come to this decision. And she did it with love, and because there was really no good that could have come of it. And so for that, absolutely, I felt like keep that secret for the family's sake, for your sake, because it wouldn't even have helped William at that point, So I agree. I had to hear your, your thought process first. I've got some rapid fire questions, which just answer quick if you can. Massachusetts or Maine?
Massachusetts.
Blueberry pie or muffins?
Blueberry pie.
Yankees or Red Sox?
Red Sox.
Swimming or boat rowing?
Swimming.
Plotting or pantsing?
Pantsing.
Worst writing habit?
Procrastination.
Best writing habit?
Dedication.
And your favorite Plowshares blog post?
Ooh, about the first one I did in a series called Fiction Responding to Fiction, which was about William Trevor, stories by William Trevor and Ian Lee.
Perfect. We'll have to go look that up. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to open it up to people that want to ask questions. If you want to, go ahead and raise your hand and you can have the opportunity to ask Laura a question. If not, y'all know me, I have a ton ready. But I know Mary Ellen wants to ask, so I'm going to go ahead and spotlight her and let her ask. Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Thank you. Laura, thank you so much for this book. I hugged it when I finished it. It touched me on so many levels. And I especially liked the perspective of the different lives the moms were living in America versus England. And I've never, ever seen them contrasted. And that I found that very meaningful. But there were so many other things too. I thought this was wonderful. Was there anything that surprised you when you wrote this book?
Well, that's a great question. I love that. Because I don't plan things and I just was moving forward in time writing this. I do think when I got to the point with talking to Gerald at the baseball game, I was surprised that she lied, actually. And I had to sit with that for a moment and think about that. And to what we just said, decide that it was the right thing. But I was surprised by that. And it's sort of emblematic of what started happening as I got towards the end of the book. I had spent so much time with these characters that they really did start to make choices on their own. And I've heard other writers say that and sort of dismissed it, thinking, oh, that's like too woo-woo for me. That's not the way I move through life. But actually, I think it does happen. I think that your subconscious rises up and these characters become really fully fledged people and make decisions. And that was a wonderful thing to experience.
That fascinates me because I don't have people talking in my head, but I love that you do. And I love that they're telling you how the story should go. Another question I have is, what authors have in particular shaped you?
So William Trevor, I just mentioned that blog post. He is my favorite short story writer. Absolutely. That he was really the master, I think, of this short story. He has a couple of collections that I absolutely recommend. They're just wonderful. And I think some of his later smaller collections, there's a collection called After Rain that I think is just fantastic. He was Irish. He spent most of his life living in England, but then moved back to Ireland towards the end of his life. And he tended to write, I think his best stories are about rural Irish people who live small lives, but he injected such humanity into them. And he's always got sort of a moral question at the heart of his work. And I just love his work. And sort of in his footsteps, I think coming along is Claire Keegan, who's written a number of, she's also very much a short story writer, and some of her stories have expanded a little bit to be called novels, but they're still very short. And she too, I think, is very interested in writing the Ireland of the late 20th century, and she's just wonderful.
Wonderful. I've not heard of William Trevor. I have heard of Claire Keegan because, of course, she's more popular these days, but I'll have to look him up.
Right. He's great.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks so much, Mary Ellen. All right, we do have a question. Here's one. The narrator was spot on, which I agree. I did listen to this as well. Did you have an input on choosing her? This is from Tracy. Thank you for that question.
That's a great question. And yes, I did, sort of to my surprise. I wasn't expecting this at all, but one day I got 3 audio tapes in my email, and they were from 3 different British narrators and actresses who were reading excerpts of the book. They were doing both British voices and American voices, so I could hear them both. And it was a fascinating thing to think through, because my gut when I first listened to them was to go with somebody who was actually, she's an actress, and her version was very alive and big and had a lot of energy. And this is a quiet book. So I thought, well, maybe that would be good, because maybe that would infuse it with a little bit of energy. But then I kept getting drawn back to one of the other ones. And I started to realize that her voice, I was part being drawn back because her voice was really familiar to me. So I looked her up. And it turned out she had narrated Hamnet. And I listened to Hamnet right at the start of the pandemic. It was kind of my refuge. Like I would come, after dinner every night, I would like come back to my office and I would listen to that, and I would do like a little knitting or something. And it was just kind of like my quiet moment of the day. And I just loved it. And I loved the way that they read Hamnet. So once I thought about that, and then I listened to her some more, and I realized how she speaks really, really slowly, and the tone just felt so right for the book. She focuses on words. And I just kind of fell in love with her voice, and I'm so glad that that's who ended up narrating the book.
Well, great decision. And I'm going to out my mother with this comment, but she listened to the narrator and she said, she's too good. I'm afraid this book is going to be too sad and I won't be able to take it. So I'm going to read the pages instead. So it won't be as sad, because sometimes that voice, right, can really make it even more emotional. So I think that's a credit to the narrator, because she was just like, I don't know that I can take that. So sorry, Mom, I just outed you. Dana has a great question. Did William have a heart attack, or was it a drunken driving accident? Since the other important men in Bee's life also had heart attacks, I assumed William did too. Correlate. I didn't think about it like that.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone else say that. That's really interesting. I think it was a drunk driving accident. I do not think he had a heart attack. Other people have asked me, somebody said, why are all the men dying, right? Somebody actually
another question.
Be careful, because all the men were dying in my book. But somebody else asked, why is everyone having a heart attack? And I think, in part that was kind of metaphorical, right? Because so much of this book is about different kinds of love. It made sense to me that these people would have heart attacks. And therefore I can see thinking that that's why that William also would have a heart attack. But no, I was not thinking that for him. I really was thinking that it was drunk driving.
Well, Gerald was living a ripe old age. So there we go. We've had a male survivor there. All right. It looks like we have another question. This one's from Sam. But before I get to her question, I want to go back, because she made an amazing comment about, we were talking about the process, that writing, what I called the Ash Spence method. Anyway, she said in therapy, we call that method, quote, process over content. It's really about the impact and the feelings of the people who experience the thing rather than the thing itself. So I thought that was fascinating. In therapy terms, it's called process over content. So I just wanted to share that with you, because Sam brought a great perspective there. But I'm going to get back to her question. She says, I am always a big fan of generational sagas, me too, and dual POVs, me too. How did you choose to write in multiple POVs? What are the challenges and benefits of writing that way?
That's a great question. Thank you. And thank you for that. Also, that process over content. I want to look that up and learn more about that. I think that's fascinating. So I got to the multiple POVs in a couple of ways. As I said, it took me a long time to figure out how to tell the story. And when I first started writing in 2008, I just had Bee as a narrator. I knew for a long time that I wanted to stretch over a long period of time, about 30 years. But I just thought she would tell us the story the whole way. And I got to about page 100. It just wasn't working. I put it aside. And then the next time I came back to it, I thought, well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need to have more narrators. So maybe what I'll do is I'll have Bee narrate the 40s and William narrate the 50s and Gerald narrate the 60s. And I worked on that for a while too, but again, I didn't feel super comfortable with either William or Gerald. I felt way more comfortable in Bee's voice, I think, because I'd been with Bee for so long, that I just never quite thought I was doing a good job with William and Gerald. And then one of the things that happened was I really did start to get interested more in the parents as well as the children, which it really had been my original interest in this kind of story, was the effect on the parents, right? When I read that newspaper article when my kids were little, I wasn't really thinking about them. I was thinking more about me as a parent. What would that be like? And so I was really fascinated in exploring both the American parents and the British parents, and thinking about, them from both sides. And so then it sort of became a math problem of figuring out if I'm going to write about, use all these points of view and cover all this time, I had to write in those really short chapters. So that's kind of how that came about. In terms of challenges of writing all these POVs, it actually made it easier for me, I think, because of these short chapters, because I could easily write one of those in a day and then I would always start the next one that day. I never left myself with a blank page. I always figured out who I was going to be with and how much time would have passed, so that I wasn't faced with that when I sat down the next day of making those choices. But it was a very manageable thing to do. And it was more akin really to writing short stories, because it was this small unit that I could finish in a day and feel comfortable about. And then move on to the next one. And it was almost like a trick, right? Because then I was accruing all these pages and I was getting to this novel length thing without even kind of thinking about the fact that I was writing a novel, because I was just writing it from all these different points of view and moving forward in time. So I think for me, it ended up being a complete benefit, because I was able to sort of do this without really thinking too hard about the fact that I was writing a novel.
Well, I've seen lots of people, Kelly says it in the chat, but I've seen it a lot on Instagram, how they do love these short chapters. And I love your adaptation to your process to make yourself keep moving, because that's so smart when you know what your deficit is, if it's procrastination, to have a positive way to start the next day. So kudos to you. Jill says, I love the timeline at the bottom of the pages. I've never seen that before. What made that decision happen?
So that happened during the year that I took that novel writing class. And it happened in part because I was getting confused about what year it was. And I'd have to kind of go back and look. And I thought, oh my God, if I'm confused, I can only imagine how confused the reader is going to be. So I need to figure out a way to keep myself in line, and then later to hopefully to keep the reader in line. But it also came about because during that year that I took that class, I had a different prologue, and in that prologue, there was a scene between William and Bea in Maine, and she had drawn up a timeline of her life and given it to him, and he had added in his dates, and so they'd sort of created this timeline together. And many people in the class did not like that prologue. They did not like the idea. They didn't believe that children would do that, would create a timeline. So I took out that prologue, but I was like, one of the reasons I loved it was I loved the idea of time and sort of underscoring the fact that this is a novel about time. And so I loved the fact that they would have been doing this timeline, and it was a way to kind of get that in there. So I was like, okay, you're not going to let me put the timeline in the prologue. I'm going to put it at the bottom of each page. So that's what I did. It was my little passive aggressive move, but I'm very happy it's there. And then I was really worried that the editor was going to not know what it was or not want it there. And they were totally happy with it. So that was wonderful. I was very happy about that.
Well, lots of people liked it. If you listen to the audiobook, you probably wouldn't know this, but we did get the year marker. Didn't get to see the bottom of that, but I did personally enjoy both. The thing that I do want to move forward to, because I know we're just over time, is we talked, Alice sort of gave us a little preview, but we didn't get enough. What are you working on next? Because she said she might have seen a little piece of that. So if you can tell us anything, we would love, love, love to hear it.
So yes, so while I was in the MFA with Alice, I worked on a number of stories that had to do with radium in the 20th century. And there were 3 characters in 3 different stories that I really loved, 3 women that live at different times in the 20th century and have their lives impacted by radium in different ways. And they were not connected in the short stories, but I've now connected them, and I'm working on creating something larger out of that. It's really a wonderful project to work on because, as I said, I love these characters, and now the opportunity to go back and spend more time with them and learn more about them, and to figure out how to connect their lives together in a way that makes sense, but also allows us to sort of see how different women lived in different ways throughout the 20th century. That's just fascinating to me. So I'm really enjoying working on that project.
Well, you're just such a smart writer. Your process, you're evolving and making what works for you even better. So keep it coming. Oh, we did have one more question. Sierra said, I wanted to ask, what was the significance of Beatrix having two names, one in England and one in America, Bee versus Trixie?
So that was a sort of very happy coincidence in that I had chosen the name Beatrix very, very early on. I really loved the name, and I loved it's such a British name to me, especially with the X at the end. And then I realized as I was writing that she actually could have a different name in America to start, that they would call her Bee, and that would be a source of tension with her mother, because her mother never wanted her to be called Bee. She always wanted her to be called Beatrix. And then I realized when she got back to London, she could have yet another name, Trix. So the fact that it wasn't even just a nickname, that there were actually two names that were just half of her original name, just worked so beautifully. It was really fun to play with as I was kind of editing the book, to think about when she would make the shift, because the chapter names change from Beatrix to Bee, and back again. And sometimes even within a chapter, within her chapters, she will think of herself as both Bee and Beatrix, because she's not quite sure where she belongs. And that was a really fun thing to think about and work through in the book.
Yeah, it makes me think of course, the Shakespeare quote, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? Because she does have two distinct identities, for a lot. I mean, she's so much more open, I think, which she's mimicking Mrs. G. And then she really closes and isolates more, in the UK and London. So it's very interesting. And we were just talking about names right before everybody hopped on. I'm going to call this the triple name author chat between myself and Laura Spence-Ash and Alice Elliott-Dark. So I think that's a good way to end this. But before I do, I almost forgot, I did see on your site, you have a film TV agent. Is that a hint of some sort that we need to know about? Is that anything happened in that realm of things?
She is working very hard, but no, nothing has happened.
We're going to keep hoping, because this is very epic. I mean, to me, it seems like it would be, I could almost see it on the screen in my head. So maybe I do have voices in my head, Mary Ellen. And then one more question that I always end with: book recommendations. Tell us things maybe you've read that you want us to read as well, or some classic in the past. We'd just love to hear.
So my first shout out, of course, would be to Alice's, all of Alice's work, but especially her most recent novel, Fellowship Point, which is now out in paperback. It is wonderful. It's set in Maine and in Philadelphia, and it's just fantastic. So I highly, highly, highly recommend that. Also from the Rutgers Newark program are two other writers who have come out with books this year that I would highly recommend. Eliza Minot wrote a novel called In the Orchard. It's her third novel. It is fantastic. It's the day in the life of a young mother. Her sentences are like no one else's. She is just a gorgeous writer. The fact that she can write a whole book about I think not even 12 hours elapses from the beginning to the end. And it's just stunning. And yeah, I highly recommend that. And then the writer Nick Fuller Guggens, his book is called The Great Transition, and that came out in August. It is a hopeful climate fiction book, which I don't think there are too many of those. And so it's really wonderful. He is a beautiful writer. He has such a heart. He cares so much about the climate and about our country. And it is just a lovely book. It has just the most amazing relationship between a father and daughter that I think I've read in a very long time. And I would highly recommend that as well.
Well, you truly are a literary citizen, as Alice said. I love that term, and I'm going to always think of you that way. Thank you so much. It's just been an amazing night. And I will say, maybe we can go back. If you haven't read Fellowship Point, maybe go back, pick it up, read it, and then go listen to the author chat, because she's truly a delight and a fantastic novelist. You're going to love it, and talk about some beautiful sentences there as well. And then, when you said you can't go back, but they did in Maine. So that was a beautiful ending back at their house. I'm going to end on that high note. But thank you, Alice. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, all you readers out there, for joining. Please make sure and check out Laura's website. You're going to find her upcoming events. She has a great book club kit with a lot of great questions. So if you want to bring this book to your book in real life book club, please do. And in addition to, we found the blueberry muffin. Somebody posted the blueberry muffin recipe in the chat. She also has a blueberry pie recipe on that website you might want to check out as well. Follow her on Instagram for her latest news. Would love for everyone to follow the LBs, the Lover of Books, both on Facebook and Bookstagram. And you're going to find reviews, recommendations, and of course, more author chats. Speaking of which, Sunday, September 24th at 8 p.m., I'm going to be chatting with another debut novelist. This time it's Mickey Brammer. She has a book of the month novel called The Collected Regrets of Clover. And to tell you about it, I'm going to go ahead and quote the book list. While this heartwarming debut novel deals with death, it never becomes maudlin, instead focusing on what makes a life worth living. Readers who appreciate seeing quirky, isolated characters come into their own, such as Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, will find much to love in this moving novel. I don't know that I'd ever read about a death doula, but it is fascinating. So I'd highly recommend you pick up that book. You know, I love supporting debut novelists. But if you know of an author that you would like to chat with, please let me know. A lot of times people give me that recommendation and it happens. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You're going to find lots of author chats there. I think we're 30 plus. So that's really exciting. And thank you, Laura. Again, it's such a great book. We've always loved it and we can't wait to share it with more readers. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me. This was a joy.
Thank you, Alice.
Yes. Thank you, Alice.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night and see you all in a couple weeks.